Doesn't matter what I do, the same thing happens. This is what my friend said to me when he was playing through Telltale's The Walking Dead. It's such a common statement mentioned by people who play these kinds of choice-based narrative games. At face value, I disagree. I mean, these are some of my favorite games, and I've played through The Walking Dead almost 5 times now. And once more to get footage for this video. Each time I play it, I'm still affected by the story. But why is that? It stuck with me, the idea that many people feel as if they don't make any decisions in these kinds of games. I wanted to take a look at some of these games and figure out what makes a decision in a programmed game an actual decision. The first thing that comes to mind is free will. So first, do we have free will in video games? And is that the same question as, do we have free will? The main arguments on the topic of free will are between free will and determinism. Free will, defined, is the power of acting without the constraint of necessity or fate, the ability to act at one's own discretion. Determinism, however, is the philosophical view that events are completely determined by previously existing causes. This can also be related to divine intervention, or a predetermined path that's set forth by a divine entity.
Should I stay?
What?
I don't want to sleep in the treehouse tonight, but I don't know if I should leave. What if my parents come home?
Now, I'm not going to communicate any specific ideas on which of these is the correct view. That's for you to decide, if you subscribe to that idea. Anyways, that's what we're dealing with here. When we look broadly at a game, we can see that everything is handcrafted by developers, and we can know that everything is predetermined. A video game, by defining characteristics, ends up being a tailored experience dictated by lines of code. So it's a deterministic classification, right?
I got you. Now show. Get this tractor off of me!
Maybe not. Let's take a look at what happens when you enter one of those worlds. Okay, I know what you're thinking. This isn't a narrative game, and you were talking about narrative games. Well, now I'm talking about this game. You see, Minecraft is the prime example of a world that you can enter and do anything that you want in. There are goals, but you don't have to complete any of them. It's a sandbox game that you can do anything that the game's mechanics allow you to do. In that sense, you have control over the things that the game allows you to control. It's obviously not a simulation of real life. But as the player, you can decide entirely how you play the game. Essentially, you're creating the narrative. So, how does this relate to, say, a Telltale game?
Do you know how to do this?
How hard can it be?
I'm going to look like a boy.
In a Telltale game, the player is immediately met with a disclaimer upon starting the game. This game series adapts to the choices you make. The story is tailored by how you play. That much is true. The player gets a sense of the game being dynamic and feeling in control until they experience the first moment when they feel like their choices don't matter.
We can't go yet.
What? Why not?
Because somebody needs to pick up the gun.
This is probably the most discussed moment over player influence in The Walking Dead. In the beginning of the game, the player must choose which of 2 characters to save, Carly or Doug. Everybody chooses Carly because she's the girl, right? Wrong. She's the person with the gun. But that's not fair to Doug, is it? I mean, he's smart, he's an idea man. He's sort of like the Eugene of this game, except nobody chose him and he died and couldn't help reestablish a society. Thanks for being a cool guy, Eugene, despite being a coward. Anyways, where was I? Oh, right. The player chooses which of these 2 characters to save.
No! Get him off of me!
Oh my god.
But then, whichever one is chosen dies later on in the game anyways.
What the fuck's the problem?
So everybody always says, my choices don't matter. It's falsely advertised. Except it isn't. For example, during episode 4 of The Walking Dead, the player has the option to save Ben or let him fall. The consequences for saving Ben mean that Kenny might be upset with you.
Lee!
However, depending on how the player handles the situation later on, Kenny comes to understand why you saved Ben, and how he shouldn't blame Ben for the death of his family. This is crucial to Kenny's character development. Now, later on, Ben dies regardless.
Ben!
However, this also affects how Kenny exits the game. For instance, when Ben falls from the balcony, Kenny goes down to save him.
Get the fuck out of here.
What?
Go back! She needs you, Lee!
Kenny!
This is not a discussion!
This is similar to what happens if you actually let Ben fall at the bell tower. If Ben were to be dead by this moment, nobody would fall from the railing. However, later on, the remaining members of the group walk past a hole in the roof of a building.
Whoa, careful.
Even the buildings are full.
But nobody falls down it. However, if Ben were already dead and Kenny were still with you, Omid would have fallen down the hole, and Kenny would have gone down after him, leaving Kenny's fate ambiguous. So essentially, the game never lied. This moment was tailored for the player. Yes, the same thing happens in the end, and ultimately Lee is on his own, but the events that led up to that changed, and this is what shapes Clementine's journey throughout the entire series. Yes, the game only tailored your decisions for a few minutes, but the player decided which way the event unfolded. In general, the response to this is similar to how we respond to our lives, emotionally. This is where these games come into play as stories that we experience and make decisions in. At the end of The Walking Dead, the player has to decide to leave the character you've played as, Lee Everett, or shoot them, preventing them from turning into a zombie. This is one of the most emotional moments in all of gaming. Most of the people who have played this game feel sad during this moment. And there's one thing that's responsible. Our emotions play this game. We make decisions based on how we feel about this pre-written character, or the situations that we found them in. The only reason that the ending of The Walking Dead is effective is because as the player, we made those decisions that led up to this moment. Because of the specific decisions that the player made during their playthrough, they experienced tailored moments that were mostly unique in their characterization of the characters, environment, and themes present in the game. It becomes a story about the journey to the end. It's a very nuanced answer, but it's what kept people invested and what built a community around the series. It's the idea that on top of a narrative that gives you a defined story, it gives you the option to define what makes you invested. Okay, that was sort of a lot for a pretty simple idea. So let's add another variable. What drives us to make the decisions? Okay, yes, I did say emotions, but there's another reason. Morals. Morals are something often touched on in many pieces of media.
What do you think?
No. We leave it.
Some things stay the same, but the driving factors behind the morals change. Religion, instinct, philosophy, and more have guided how individuals and groups shape their moral belief systems. When it comes to these narrative games, we usually end up doing what we find justifiable. Take Beyond Two Souls, for instance.
I was born with a strange gift. The ability to see what no human being has ever seen before.
Okay, at this point, there will be some mild spoilers for Beyond Two Souls ahead. It's going to include me glossing over some of the major plot points and summarizing them ambiguously so that anyone watching can go and play the game for themselves. I think I'll still be able to get my point across, but I want to clarify that I'm purposefully being a little bit ambiguous and simple with some of my explanations of the game, specifically the ending. Regardless, I'd still highly recommend playing the game for yourself as it is a great experience. So we're met with Jodie, played by Elliot Page, who has telekinetic powers that aren't as they seem. Ever since Jodie was born, she has had a paranormal entity attached to her. His name is Aiden. His soul is attached to Jodie, and he's sort of the one responsible for the telekinetic powers. In this game, you play as both Jodie and Aiden over the course of Jodie's life as she is experimented on.
Thank you, Dad. It's so pretty.
Open it.
Jodie? You okay?
Used as a weapon by the military, and consulted as a paranormal and otherworldly expert. Throughout all of this, the player makes decisions as both Jodie and Aiden. This determines everything that the player experiences. There are far more dynamic pieces of gameplay in this game than there are in The Walking Dead. It even has Willem Dafoe.
Just take a deep breath. There's no reason to panic.
Alright, the point is, it has a lot of moments where the player utilizes this idea of making a decision, and a potentially just one at that.
It's gonna be all right.
There's this scene where Jodie goes to a birthday party. Up until this point, Jodie had mostly been on her own and distant from kids her own age. She was deemed special by the government, enough to experiment with her and Aiden's abilities. So at this party, she's experiencing what normal kids her age are into, and what they're like. This is fine until they all start teasing her about her differences and demand she demonstrates her abilities.
No. I don't have powers.
I told you so, guys. It's all bullshit.
I can't believe you came all the way to my birthday party just to give me this old crap.
And she thinks she's so clever. But she's just a little lab rat.
A freaky little lab rat.
Yeah. She's been following me around like a puppy all evening, begging for it.
Oh. And she's a slut, too.
The player can react in many ways, including hostility by using Aiden to harm the teenagers. The player can display their morally deemed appropriate response in this situation. This is a great way to show how an experience is tailored for the player, but it can also evoke new emotions as a response.
Get me out of here. Please.
The player might have a new take on their morals as they witness the events of their story unfold. And this is an interesting idea to consider, as the player is in control of what they endure. But what does that say about their morals? In an article titled Free Will and Moral Responsibility in Video Games by Christopher Bartel, Bartel discusses the moral implications of committing violent acts in video games. I recommend reading this article and indulging their viewpoint on this, but for now, I just want to highlight the following. Near the end of the text, Bartel states, "The unwilling player might develop a fictional moral psychology that she applies to Trevor, and she acts within the game in a way that is consistent with his fictional moral psychology. It is in this sense that a player can play a game as a villain, just as an actor can play the part of a villain without thereby coming to hold the same moral viewpoint as the villain." Now, for context, they're discussing the morality of unwilling actions in video games, and have specifically looked at a couple of Rockstar Games' titles. In this case, Grand Theft Auto 5, hence Trevor. This is where we can expand on decision-based games. The player is able to create a villain and explain their story through their actions. In the case of Bartel's statement, and relating it to Beyond Two Souls, the player is actually transforming their narrative and doing more than just playing a villain. The ability to use emotional and moral reactions to make a decision is how the player gives themselves context for the game they're playing. To be the one calling the shots, or in the case of The Walking Dead, defining your characterization, is to reflect upon your own beliefs and is putting yourself in the shoes of the characters at play. Beyond Two Souls demonstrates all of this at once. The player is given many choices and opportunities to influence the story that Jodie and Aiden experience. What's interesting is that the game gives a polarizing choice at the end of the game. Everything that you experience in this game is the story of a single life. Jodie has been through a lot of hell, and as I played the game, I kept wondering how all of this was going to stop. How can Jodie get out of the mess that she was born into? This is where the game changes. Everything that had happened in Jodie's life was the result of many choices and a few things that were out of her control. In relation to how things might be out of someone's control, this game does a great job using a story as a means to guide the limitations of making decisions in a video game. So, the The game pivots into this final chapter where a lot of different plot points come together. A huge machine meant to bridge the gap between our world and a paranormal realm known as the Infraworld is activated, and Jodie's final goal is to shut it down. Before trying to shut down the condenser, the player is presented with the following screen. Life or beyond. At this moment, the player is left to make a decision for Jodie, which involves choosing life and losing Aiden, or choosing beyond and joining Aiden. It's a heavy ultimatum. If we're looking back at the initial "do choices matter" question, we're kind of left with some gravity. To me, this final question isn't just for Jodie. It's for the player to apply to their own life. It's essentially asking you whether you would return to a life with potential suffering but the opportunity of happiness, which is present in Jodie's life, or to leave it all behind for something beyond. It's at this point where no matter how many times I play this game, I have to admit that I cannot commit to choosing beyond. It's a decision that just feels outside of my morals. It's just like how in The Walking Dead, I will never leave Lee to turn into a zombie. I have to force Clementine to shoot him. I have locked myself out of different decisions because of my morals, and that is what makes the topic of having free will hard to discuss. I subscribe to the idea of having a sense of self-agency and being able to make my own decisions, but I live by a set of morals that limit the options I would take. This has become a question that's bigger than simply having free will in video games, but now opens up more avenues for understanding why we make decisions in games in the first place. Now, that's it for this video. I hope you found a sense of your own stance on free will, or what it means to make a decision based on the ideas I presented here. I highly recommend playing the games discussed here and experiencing them for yourself, because, well, the game is tailored by how you play.
If I had to say how it all began, I might just as well start here.